Yeshuvah come, and all of the good prophecies of the prophets, they materialized. So obviously, the establishment of the state of Israel is such a major event in the history of the Jewish people. For 2,000 years we were in exile. For 2,000 years we were under persecution, and especially after the Holocaust. So a major event like this, of the establishment of the state of Israel, which is the sign of a future redemption, that it is obviously it should be in the prophets. There should be a prophecy about the state of Israel. There's prophecies about the destruction of the temple. So there should also be a prophecy about the redemption. So my question to you, is there a prophecy about the state of Israel? Yeah.
So when we say the state of Israel, you can refer to a lot of things. We can say, is there a prophecy about Medinat Yisrael, the state that we have now, with the constitution we have now, and a unicameral Knesset of 120, and a prime minister and a president? Or is it, or are you referring to more generally there being a ruling Jewish government over Eretz Yisrael? That's my question. I'm asking you to go into more detail about the question.
So, if that's a very good point, what you said, and I would say something in the middle, okay? Because for the state of Israel, it is a huge miracle. It is a great milestone towards the redemption, but nevertheless, it is not perfect. And when we speak about the vision of the nation of Israel in the future, so we actually dream of a state which is going to be filled with a Torah, filled with Yiddishkeit, filled with a Jewish identity, and all of these things that I just mentioned, they don't always appear in the state of Israel, to say it in one sentence. So the question is there a prophecy of some kind of government which isn't perfect, which is going to be before the final redemption? Because there are prophecies about the final redemption, but is there something in the middle? Is there a prophecy that it tells us about the present state of the state of Israel? So what do you think?
I'll guess yes. I hope yes.
I'm assuming there is a prophecy about a state of Israel. Although I there's significant criticisms of the modern state of Israel. And that's why I asked my question earlier. Is the modern state of Israel?
Right.
It's unfortunately, it's most of the people in government are quite are well. There's a lot. I'm not going to say most of them. I would say there are many of them who are quite secular. And I can't imagine there being a prophecy about, so the Jews are going to have control, but it's not going to be religious Jews. There'll be a significant religious minority, but the majority are going to be non-religious Jews. That does not register with reality. So that's my answer.
Okay, good. So let's see.
So
yeah.
I can't can't memorize any prophecy that says like the return of Israel with the government that we have like in this form right now. But we have like the most famous prophecy from Ezekiel with the dry bones.
Right, Machon.
And many would argue that like how the bones come together first, like they're just dry bones, they just go back together to form a human, a skeleton, basically. But there's still no ruach in them. There's no spirit in them.
Right.
And people or some say that this resembles the secular state of Israel in a way that there is no spirit, there's no religious like kadosh spirit in it, but we have the form, the construct, like the construct of the state.
Beautiful, beautiful. This is a very special prophecy that you just mentioned.
Is it mentioned here in the sheet?
Yes, it is. In you saw in the page 3, number 3. In Ezekiel, in Yechezkel, which is exactly what we are talking about. That as you said, that Yechezkel tells us about the dry bones, but they are revived, and then there is the second process, as you said, that the spirit has to come into them to give them the life force. So one could definitely say that about the process that we are in nowadays. So with your permission, I would like to explore with you a couple of different prophecies that talk about the physical redemption of the nation of Israel after the exile. And then after we do that, there's a very, very special a prophecy that actually talks about the modern state of Israel. And this is something extraordinary. It is something that most people don't know. It is a prophet called Micha. And then we are going to see...
The 12 minor prophets, correct?
That's right, we're going to study it momentarily, but first, just for a short background, to examine a few of the famous prophecies. Okay, so you could see it in section A, prophecies about the redemption. Okay, so the first famous prophecy, it is also from Ezekiel. Ve'atem הרי ישראל ענפיכם תיתנו ופרייכם תישאו לעם ישראל כי יקרבו לבוא. So this is a prophecy speaking about the hills of Israel, the land of Israel, which is going to give a fruit. Now, why is it a dramatic prophecy? Because that for 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years, the land of Israel was completely empty. The land of Israel was barren. It was like a desert. There were swamps in the Chula Valley. It was a terrible place to live in. And actually, this is also a prophecy. He said mentioned in the Parashat Bechukatai. It says one of the curses, because there are a list of curses in the Parashat Bechukatai, and one of them is, it is actually a blessing. It says, "V'shamemu alea oivechem," that the moment that the nation of Israel goes to exile, our enemies aren't going to be able to form any kind of government over here. They aren't going to be able to live in the land of Israel. And this was true throughout history. If there was no kingdom that actually survived here for a long time. It is a yeshuva via crusaders. They tried to establish some kind of a kingdom, but they were defeated by Salah ad-Din, and even the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, they didn't. Their capital city, it wasn't over here. It was in. That's right. At the time, it was. So, and even in the early 1900s, when Mark Twain came over here, very famous journey. So he describes that this is a barren place. There is no hope over here. There is hardly any civilized people around here. There is nothing here. And then, very shortly after that, something changed. And this is the prophecy in Ezekiel says that the land of Israel, when it starts to give its fruit again, when it starts to blossom, this is a definite sign that the redemption is coming, because the nation of Israel is going to come back to its home. And this is what it says in the Talmud, in a tractate Sanhedrin. It says, "V'amar Rabbi Abba en haketz megule mizeh." There is no better proof that the redemption is on its way than the hills of Israel are giving their fruit. So this is something very important to understand. Now, the Vilna Gaon, whose a picture is over here at the right-hand side, he lived in Vilna. He died in 1797 at the age of 77. He was one of the greatest Kabbalists. He was actually great in anything. He even wrote a book on algebra and geometry. He was absolutely amazing in any perspective. He wrote a commentary on the Tanakh. He wrote a very special commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and he wrote books about Kabbalah, on the Midrashim, on any part of the Torah. He actually knew the whole Torah by heart. And as I said, he was a Kabbalist, and he foresaw that very soon the prophecy of Ezekiel is going to materialize, because, as I said, he died at 1797, but he knew that at year 1840, the land of Israel is going to start to revive. It is going to start to blossom and give its fruit. So he sent his pupils to come to Eretz Israel to make Aliyah. They were the first Zionists. Okay, we are mistaken to think that the Zionist movement actually what? That's right.
No, even with the Zionist conference.
Before, there was the first Aliyah to Eretz Israel from Chovevei Tzion. It was an organization in Russia. and they came at 1882. But the pupils of the Gra, they were the first Zionists, because that he understood that at year Hei Tafresh, Hator, 1840, there is going to be the beginning of a redemption, the Atchalta de Gula. And how did he know this? Because there is a verse in the Shir HaShirim, you could see it, where there is a little number 1 for the footnote, but it's in the middle, next to his picture. הניצנים נראו בארץ, עת הזמיר הגיע וכל התור נשמע בארצנו. Meaning that the buds are seen in our land, the time of the redemption is coming, וכל התור נשמע בארצנו. Now, Hator, it is a Hei Tafresh. If there's a here's the marker pen. So it says Kol Hator. Okay. So it is Hei Tafresh. It is 1840 in Gematria. Okay. So this is the verse from Shir HaShirim, and then he knew that at the year 1840 everything is going to start. Yes.
It's interesting because if you think about the period, if you think about the years, if you think about that century, the Hei Tafresh century, is one of the worst in Jewish history.
That's right. That's right.
What we see around the mid 1800s, especially in the United States, you see the Reform movement, and what is it? Of course, what started right around the end of the Hei Tafresh century, was the Shoah. So it's interesting to me. I was saying in hindsight, we know what happened in Tafshin Chet, but still, it's to me there's sort of a sick irony to it. How we're saying that this is when it's all going to start, but then then we have one of the worst centuries in Jewish history.
That's right. So it's a very, very good question what you asked. And I believe that the question is better than the answers. But what I could say is that one very fundamental point in the redemption process is that it does never go in a straight line. There are always going to be bumps along the way. There are always going to be challenges. There are always going to be difficulties. And it says, "Yedome dodi letzvi." There's a verse in the Shir HaShirim, and the Chazal say that if this is a parable to the redemption of the nation of Israel, because if you would go down to a gazelle valley. I live very close to a gazelle valley. And then you look at the gazelles running. So suddenly you see that they disappear. And you think that they are gone. But the truth is that they only went into a Vadi, and then we are going to appear again. So Tzvi is a gazelle. And what the Chazal are trying to tell us that the redemption is always going to have challenges in it. It is never going to be perfect. It is never going to be but from 1840, everything is going to be fine now. This is one of the fundamental ideas that the Gaon Mevilna himself he told his pupils, which they wrote in a book called Kol Hator. And this is something that also Rav Kook says. So this idea is going to help us understand also the prophecy in Micha, which we're going to see soon. So the Vilna Gaon said that the redemption is going to start at 1840. Okay? 42 years afterwards, there was, for the first time in history, a major aliyah to the land of Israel, called the first aliyah, and they called it A'ale Batamar. Okay? Batamar, it is Taf Reish Mem Bet. Okay, so if you're talking about Hator, when the redemption is starting, so Taf Reish Mem Bet. So, and actually from then, the land of Israel, it started to blossom. The Chalutzim, they were able to dry out the swamps in the Chula Valley. Now, it was very, very dangerous at that time because that there were mosquitoes there that they carried the disease of the malaria, and thousands of people died, but they understood that it had to be done, and with a lot of mesirut nefesh, a lot of self-sacrifice, they made the land of Israel blossom and flourish like it is today. That's right. And then, after a couple of years, so there's an interesting letter by the Chafetz Chaim. And Chafetz Chaim was one of the greatest rabbis at that time. And you could see a picture of him on page 3. That's right. He wrote the Mishnah Berurah. Right, yeah. And he lived in a town called Radin in Poland. And he died at 1933, age 94. And he heard of the waking up of the nation of Israel, coming to the land of Israel, of Zionism, and he writes, "Ha'it'orut ha'gdola b'kol pinot amenu la'alot le'artzenu." This awakening of a nation to make aliyah to the land of Israel, it actually is telling us, "Ki hayamim yemei ikveta de Mashiach." These are the days prior to the Mashiach. וכי פקד השם את עמו, ואפשר הוא התחלת דקיבוץ גלויות שהוא קודם ביאת המשיח. And he says that this is probably the kibbutz galuyot that the exiles from 2,000 years, they're gathering it together to make aliyah. And it is interesting because what we say every day in a Tfilat Shmoneh, in a prayer, so we say, first of all, we say Birkat HaShanim, we write Birkat HaShanim, when we pray that the land of Israel is going to give its fruit, and then afterwards, so we say Yitzkar b'shofar gadol, it is over kibbutz galuyot. So the Talmud says that it is specifically in this order, that first the land of Israel gives its fruit, and then the nation of Israel comes back. So this is something that Baruch Hashem we could sit over here after the establishment of the state of Israel, and say, these prophecies have been fulfilled. The land of Israel gave its fruit. The nation of Israel came back from most of the countries of the world, and there is even a prophecy that the nation is going to come back from Arzot HaTzafon, from the lands of the north. And so with this is talking about the Great Aliyah in 1991. After the Soviet Union fell apart, and the Jews of Russia, they came back to Israel. This is something extraordinary. 1 million Jews came back. So it's amazing to see these prophecies that they materialized. And now we're going to ask a very serious question. The question that the Rav Tzvi Yehuda, who was the son of a rabbi cook, he died in 1982. 40 years ago, age 90, and he says, you could see in the source 4. So he asks the question, is this the state that the prophets foresaw? So he says, yes, this is the state. And there are prophecies about the establishment of the state of Israel. Then he says, כמובן אין המדינה בתכלית השלמות. The state of Israel is not perfect. אולם נביאינו ורבותינו ממשיכיהם אמרו שהמדינה תהיה כמו זרע אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, ישובו ויקימו בתקומה יישובית ושלטון מדיני עצמאי. So he says that our prophets and our rabbis told us that the sons of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are going to come back to the land of Israel. They didn't tell us if they're going to be tzaddikim or not tzaddikim. They said that they're going to come. ואומר הנביא, בקבצי את בית ישראל, וישובו עליה לבטח, ובנו בתים ונטעו כרמים. So this is a very strange prophecy. It says that when Hashem is going to bring the nation of Israel back to the land of Israel, the people of Israel are going to build houses and they are going to plant vineyards.
So about the people of Israel are going to build houses.
Mm-hmm.
So it's talking about the Jewish people, the Bnei Yisrael, or like people that live in Eretz Yisrael?
Bnei Yisrael.
Because not much Jews are building houses nowadays. It's like the Arabs and any Chinese people that want to try to buy land.
About construction.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So the nation of Israel are going to build houses and they're going to plant vineyards. So Rav Tzvi Yehuda says, wait, is this what we were waiting for? For 2,000 years, would we going to come and build houses and plant vineyards? It should have said that we are going to come back and we're going to build yeshivas, we're going to build more yeshivas like Machon Meir, and we're going to build synagogues, and we're going to build all kinds of... That's right. That's right. So Rav Tzvi Yehuda says that we have to understand that the redemption starts with a physical foundation, and then on top of it you could build the spiritual foundation. Okay, first you have to build the houses, and then you could turn them into yeshivas. So he says, אמנם מתוך החזרת ישראל אל אדמתם, נביא לידי הגדלת התורה והאדרתה, אולם הצעד הראשון, ישראל על אדמתם. So we have to have patience, we have to have a patience that the state of Israel is not perfect. It is a secular state, but it is going to change. It's going to change slowly. So now, we're going to see the most astonishing prophecy about the state of Israel. Everything until now, it was just a background in order to understand the context and to see the prophecies about the stages of the redemption. But now, we're going to see the prophecy about the state of Israel. Okay? So, as I said, it is in Micha. So it says like this. I'm first going to read it in Hebrew and then in English. In a source number 5. ואתה מגדל עדר, אופל בת ציון, עדיך תאטה, ובאה הממשלה הראשונה, ממלכת לבת ירושלים. So the translation in English, and you, Migdal Eder, right, Ophel of the daughter of Zion, they will come back to you, and the first government will arrive, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. So, this is a very, very strange prophecy, and it is difficult to understand what it's saying. But the Malbim, who you could see a picture of him here at a page 4. He lived in Kiev, Russia, and he died in 1879. He actually saw the beginning of the Zionistic movement, and also he is supported the Zionistic movement, and he died at age 70. He is actually one of the greatest commentators on the Nach. He has also got a beautiful commentary on the Torah, on all of the Tanakh, and he was also a very great scholar. And he says like this, it is almost impossible to study a Tanakh without looking at the Malbim, because he says the most greatest ideas. So he says like this. He tells us that there are going to be 3 different stages in the redemption. So he says that the first stage is Kibbutz Galuyot. The first stage, it is that the nation of Israel is going to come back to the land of Israel after 2,000 years. This is the first stage of the redemption. And he learns it from the pasuk that we just read, that it says, and you, Migdal Eder, Ophel of the daughter of Zion, they will come back to you. They will come back to you. This is a kibbutz galuyot, yes? Eder, it is like a flock of a sheep, like it's a flock of sheep coming back. Okay? And so, first of all, he says that the nation of Israel are going to come back to you. Okay? So then he says that the second stage is the establishment of the state of Israel. Okay, so what does it say? It says, and the first government will arrive. Uba hamemshala harishona. So he says like this, you can see. Tavo memshala ktana. There is going to come a small government. Sheyelem ketzat memshala. We're going to have a little bit of authority and leadership והנהגה, כמו שהיו לישראל בימים הראשונים לפני מלך לבני ישראל. It's going to be a small government, like at the times of the Shoftim, at the time of the judges. That's right, before Shaul, before the kings, שהיה להם שופטים מנהיגים, they had judges that led them. Okay, so the state of Israel is actually the first government. הממשלה הראשונה, it is the first government for 2,000 years of exile. Okay, now the third stage, so it says at the rest of the verse, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. Okay, so now we're getting closer to the redemption. It is the first kingdom of Jerusalem. It is the kingdom of David. Okay, and then he says, יהיה להם מלכות קבוע, שהוא מלכות בית דוד. After the first government, they are going to have a kingdom, a proper kingdom, which is the kingdom of David. שאחר כך ימלוך המלך המשיח בממלכה הקבועה. And then the Mashiach is going to come. So if to summarize this a prophecy according to the explanation of the Malbim, so the establishment of the state of Israel, it is actually the second process in the redemption, and it is the stage prior to the kingdom of David. Okay? What? That's right. So now we're going to try and understand what is the meaning of this prophecy, and we're going to see that there is a very important meaning for our days. But first of that, we have to ask a question. Do you think that every stage stands by itself, or does it have a connection to the stage before, and does it prepare the stage afterwards? In different words, is the establishment of the state of Israel part of a process of the kingdom of Beit David, or it's something completely different? What do you say?
I feel like it has to be
I think
sequential.
it's a process.
Process.
It has to be top on top.
That's right. So obviously, as you said, every stage prepares the ground for the next stage. Okay? As we found that the Aliyot to Eretz Yisrael is starting from 1882, they prepared the ground for the establishment of the state of Israel. If a nation of Israel wouldn't have made Aliyah in Mesirut Nefesh and self-sacrifices at the time of the Mapilim, everybody knows the story of the boat, the Exodus, that was drowned, and the Struma that was sent back to the concentration camps by the British. So there was Mesirut Nefesh. The people of Israel sacrificed themselves in order to come to the state of Israel. And before that, coming here already at 1840, when there was nothing here, as Mark Twain said, and the poverty, the swamps, the malaria, the difficulties from the Arabs, many, many difficulties, but the nation of Israel was determined to come back to its land, and because of this determination, was it possible for the establishment of the State of Israel. So, in the same way, the establishment of the State of Israel prepares the ground for the kingdom of David. This is what the Malbim says, and he also tells us something very, very important. He says that the kingdom of David isn't just going to appear all of a sudden from nowhere. It is going to be built on the foundations of the State of Israel. So he says like this, you could see in the middle of page 5, Shemalchut Beit David titgale behadraga. It is going to appear slowly, it is going to gradually. Utchila lo yerak b'madrigat shofet. At the beginning, it is only going to be like a judge, okay, like at the time of the judges, in a very simple level. V'yit'aleh le'at le'at, and it's going to be elevated slowly. Ad sheyeh laHashem ha'melucha. Until the State of Israel is going to turn into the kingdom of Beit David, in a very slow process. So, the Malbim actually tells us something extraordinary, that the meaning of the establishment of the State of Israel, it is a vital process, a vital stage in the process of a redemption. And this actually gives us 3 very important lessons, which we are going to conclude with them. So, first of all, it teaches us to have faith in the potential of the State of Israel. This is the state that the prophets foresaw. We have to believe in the potential of the State of Israel to grow into the kingdom of Beit David. We have to know that we have to do everything we can to invest in the state in order to help it grow spiritually. Second, not to fall into despair when there are difficulties. The prophet Micha, in his prophecy, he actually foresaw that the State of Israel is not going to be perfect. Uba ha'memshala harishona. That's right.
There's always been something.
That's right. That is a good point. But it's specifically when we see a secular state, one could lose hope. One could say this is a secular state with all kinds of difficult things happening. But we have to believe in the State of Israel and not to give up, even if there are difficulties, because it says, Uva hamimshala harishona, and the first government is going to come. Now, every beginning has difficulties, okay? If this is, the State of Israel is only going to be 74 years on a Thursday. That's right, on Wednesday night, like 74 is nothing in the history of nations, okay? It is nothing in the history of the states. So sometimes we have too high expectations at too short time. So he says that the Malbim also, as we mentioned, he compared the state of Israel as the period of the judges. And now, at the period of the judges, it was filled with difficulties. Okay, the nation of Israel worshipped idols most of the time of the judges. And like, what? That's right. The spiritual, moral level of the nation of Israel then was in a terrible state. And it was filled with wars from in and from outside. There were many wars with the Plishtim and with Midianim and all kinds of different enemies who came and tried to conquer us. So we shouldn't give up, even if we see that there are difficulties in the state of Israel, because this is how it's supposed to be. Thirdly, and lastly, we have to know that this is a long and slow process. The Malbim said specifically that the state of Israel is going to elevate slowly. It is going to take a long time until gradually the kingdom of David is going to be built from it. So that's why it is important to have patience and to understand that great processes take time, and what we have to do is to do what we can to put more Yiddishkeit in the state of Israel. Every page of the Gemara that we study here in Machon Meir and in other yeshivot builds another.
The yeshivot build them.
That's right, yeah.
Then we know the process is really coming.
That's right. So, Bezrat Hashem, may we see in our time the final redemption.
Amen.